recognition.
Mr. Chairman, given the sensitivities surrounding confidential tax information pursuant to House Rule 11-2G1, I move that the committee go into executive session for consideration of referring for criminal prosecution Lois Lerner, the former IRS Director of Exempt Organizations, by the United States Attorney General.
The clerk will call the roll.
Parliamentary inquiry.
The clerk will call the roll.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will call the roll.
No, Mr. Chairman, I
Point-
have a right for a point of order.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Chairman.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Those points of order will be able to be made once we go into executive
no,
session.
They are about
Oh,
the
we need to do this in
Mr.
public.
Chairman.
What is the point of
order?
order? What is the gentleman's
Mr. Chairman, I have a right for a point of order.
Just chill out. What is the gentleman's
No,
point of
no,
order?
you follow procedure, sir.
What is the gentleman's point of order?
I'm very chilled out.
Okay, what is the gentleman's point of order?
I would ask that the motion be read again, and then I want to raise a point of order.
Will the gentleman please repeat his motion?
Mr. Chairman, given the sensitivities surrounding confidential taxpayer information pursuant to House Rule 11-2G1, I move that the committee go into executive session for consideration of referring for criminal prosecution Lois Lerner, the former IRS Director of Exempt Organizations, by the United States Attorney General.
Mr.
The gentleman
my point
will
of
state
order.
his point of order.
There's a reference here to this confidential taxpayer information. We should be able to discuss in open session whether there was a need to proceed on this path violating taxpayer confidentiality. We should be doing this in open session and not in executive session. That's my point of order, and I think it's a very legitimate point of order. We need to talk about publicly the way the majority here is proceeding, which leads to unprecedented violation of taxpayer confidentiality.
Well, the gentleman has stated his point of order, and the point of order is precisely why we're having to go into executive session. And let me say, as the gentleman well knows, this motion is non-debatable. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson?
Say it again. You need to say it louder.
Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Brady? Mr. Brady, aye. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Nunez? Mr. Nunez, aye. Mr. Teaberry? Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Bustani? Mr. Bustani, aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Gerlach? Mr. Gerlach, aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Schock? Mr. Schock, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black? Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Young? Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Griffin? Mr. Griffin, aye. Mr. Renacci? Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Levin?
No.
Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Rangel? Mr. McDermott?
No.
Mr. McDermott, no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Neal?
No.
Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Becerra? Mr. Doggett?
Against cutting off all the microphones, no.
Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson?
No.
Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson?
No.
Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer? No. Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind? Mr. Kind, no. Mr. Pascrell? No. Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley? No. Mr. Crowley, no. Ms. Schwartz? Mr. Davis? No. Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez?
No.
Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Rangel? Mr. Lewis? Mr. Becerra? Ms. Schwartz? Chairman Camp?
Aye.
Chairman Camp, aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
23 ayes, 12 noes.
There being 23 ayes and 12 noes, the motion is agreed to. I ask that all members of the public, press, member office staff, and non-designated committee staff leave the room so we can go into executive or closed session.